Hey everybody, today we are starting a series through the book of Hosea. Hosea is kind of the first of what is called the minor prophets. The minor prophets are called minor prophets mainly because they're shorter than the major prophets. They're quite short compared to Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. And so Hosea is kind of the first in that line. Hosea is a really interesting book. It might be a book that is difficult for us to read. I just want to give a little bit of background to this book today as we're reading the first three chapters. It's a pretty quick read, but Hosea lived from about 755, worked from about 755 to about 722 BC. This is a period that's really significant because he lived in the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember that those kingdoms went to war and they eventually split, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Hosea lived in and worked as a prophet in Israel, in the northern kingdom. And this is kind of at the end of the northern kingdom's reign. So he lived under a king named Jeroboam II, who is not a great guy. He was a powerful king, but not a great guy. And the land of Israel during Hosea's time was a really interesting place. They were living in the shadow of Assyria, which is a rising empire kind of to the northeast of Israel. And they were putting pressure on the Israelites, and Jeroboam kind of doubled down on fighting against them. And he kind of instituted a lot of these social policies that made the rich richer and the poor poorer. Some people got kind of fat and greedy during his reign, while other people really suffered. But the more interesting thing that was going on is that there had been a shift, that Jeroboam kind of adopted the local Canaanite religion, which worshiped the god Baal, B-A-A-L, who is seen as a bull. That was kind of his figure. And so a golden calf was kind of erected in the different temples of the northern kingdom in Bethel and in Dan. And people would go and they'd worship these idols to Baal. And in fact, the people were so confused by this that they kind of integrated the worship of God, of Yahweh, and Baal together. They kind of saw these two distinct gods as the same, and they started worshiping this god, Baal. And they had been doing this on and off for centuries. The golden calf goes all the way back to the Exodus story of Moses at Mount Sinai when he's up on the mountain. And so this imagery has continued on with these people for hundreds of years. They haven't been able to shake this idolatry, and now they've kind of syncretized or intertwined the worship of God and the worship of Baal, and people just have no idea that the two entities are completely separate and have very little to do with each other. Part of the worship of Baal is that people would go and they would engage in these what's probably most easily called temple prostitution. That in order to gain Baal's favor, you would go to the temple and you would probably sleep with a priest or priestess, and that act kind of signified that Baal has is favorable toward you. And so this is happening kind of on a universal scale in the kingdom. So there's kind of greed and corruption. There's power games at play. There's the shadow of the Assyrian people hanging largely over the kingdom of Israel. There's kind of these wars and skirmishes that are breaking out. And there's this worship of this god Baal and all the practices that come with it. It was not a really good place to live in. It was a scary and uncertain times. And so Hosea is preaching in the middle of this. But his ministry is very different than some of the others because God, in the chapters that we look at, asked him to do something pretty intense. He says to Hosea, I want you to go and marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. And so Hosea does this. And you think, why on earth would God cause this to happen? Why would God ask a godly man to go and marry someone who is scandalous. And yet, throughout the book, we see that this is Hosea acting out this speech act, is what we call it, of God displaying in really tangible images and pictures through Hosea's marriage what the people's relationship with God looks like. That they are like this promiscuous woman who have gone after these other gods and goddesses, who have abandoned Yahweh, the person who loved her and called her and married her. And the people are just like this woman, that they cannot help themselves but continue to rebel and run away from God. And Hosea compares this kind of unfaithfulness as adultery. It's like spiritual adultery, that Israel is cheating on God. God being the faithful husband who's kind and generous, and the people, the wife, continues to cheat. And it's really interesting here because Hosea then has kids with her, and the kids all have these really sad names. So first is the name Jezreel, which is all about bloodshed. And then we have Lo Ruhama, which means not loved. Imagine naming your kid that. Hey, your name is not loved. Then we have one more kid named Lo Ami, which means not my people, which are pretty intense names. So these children are kind of like judgments against this unfaithful wife. You're not loved, you're all about bloodshed, and you're not my people. And yet, we have this description throughout the book of Hosea about Israel's sinfulness, in the depths of their sinfulness, and how badly they have abandoned God and mistreated one another and have cheated on God in these really graphic ways, like a promiscuous wife. And yet, we have these images of hope where despite, and this is what happens in the story, Hosea marries this promiscuous woman, Gomer. She cheats and abandons her husband and goes back into prostitution, and yet he is called to go and buy her back. So he comes, and in chapter 2, verse 14, this is God speaking to his people. He says, "Therefore I'm going to allure her, my wife, Israel. I will lead her into the wilderness. I will speak tenderly to her." And then there's all these promises of hope and restoration, and the kids' names get changed from God about bloodshed to God planting, about being not loved to being the one that I love, to being not my people to being you are my people. And Hosea then lives this out by going and finding his wife who has since abandoned him, and he buys her back out of the sexual slavery that she had sold herself into. It's this really incredible picture of God's judgment against sin and spiritual adultery on one hand, and God's never stopping, never giving up compassionate love, where despite our unfaithfulness, the people's unfaithfulness, there's still hope, and God is going to redeem and rescue his people. So that's just the first 3 chapters. As we get into the rest of the book, God will bring these further lawsuits against his people for various things, but also in the midst of this judgment, there is hope. There's these 2 balances, that God punishes sin, but God wants to heal and restore and redeem. It's this really amazing and powerful picture that gets lived out in a real way through an actual family. So that's just part 1 of Hosea. We'll see you next week for the next couple of chapters. See you then. Bye.